Getting a shallow depth of field can sometimes help you get a cinematic feel. That's when the plane of focus is so slim that objects between the camera and the subject are blurry, as are objects behind the subject. So it really isolates your subject and makes it stand out against the background. Here are some examples where the subject or part of it is sharp, but the background melts away into a blur and it makes sure your attention is on the subject. This is the shallow depth of field effect. It looks pretty, you might say dreamy if it's a really blurry background, and for lots of people that means cinematic. Now some full frame people would say that you can't get a shallow depth of field on the GH5 or GH5S, and that's to do with the smaller sensor size. And there might be some truth to that. It is a bit more difficult to do than if you were on a full frame camera, but it is absolutely possible, even to the extent sometimes that I'm struggling to keep my subject in focus. Here's a few examples from the GH5. In either case, we shouldn't get hung up on a shallow depth of field. There's much more that goes into a cinematic image than just a shallow depth of field. Just look at DPs like Roger Deakins, who worked on Skyfall and No Country for Old Men. It's not just the big vista scenes which have a deep depth of field, it's also some of the ones with dialogue, and it's more about composition for him than just getting a shallow depth of field. And our Micro Four Thirds cameras would actually have an advantage in some cases over a full frame camera, because sometimes when you want that deep depth of field, you have to stop down on the aperture quite far to get it. And imagine if you're in a low light situation, but you need a deep depth of field, you've got to stop down on the aperture, so your image is looking quite dark, and at that point you've got to really pump up the ISO, and that can impact lots of things for your image. I would struggle to get shots like this, for example, on a full frame camera, without really pumping up the ISO just to get the depth of field that I want. Anyway, if you do want a shallow depth of field, let's talk about how you can get that on the GH5 and GH5S. So the first factor I'm going to discuss affecting the depth of field you get on these cameras is the focal length that you're using. Now this and some of the other tips aren't necessarily unique to the GH5 and GH5S, but they're worth bearing in mind. So if you stood in the same position using the same f-stop, a longer focal length lens will give you a shallower depth of field than a wider lens. On these cameras, the 42.5 does enough for me, but obviously you can go longer if you want to. Secondly, you need to consider how fast your lens is or how wide the aperture goes. If your lens can only go down to f4, something in that region, you're going to struggle to get a shallow depth of field compared to somebody working with a 1.2, for example. Speaking of 1.2, this Sigma Art 18-35mm is a wildly popular option in the Micro Four Thirds world. It's special in the zoom world because it's so fast at a 1.8 aperture, but also because that aperture is constant all the way through the zoom range. Now f1.8 is already pretty decent, but if you combine that with a focal reducer such as this Metabone speed booster, you can actually get even better than that. So this f1.8 combined with a Metabone's ultra speed booster becomes an f1.2. So you can see why it's so popular. It's attacking two of the weaknesses of our cameras. That's the low light performance and the ability to get a shallow depth of field. Comes at a pretty hefty cost though, because fast lenses aren't cheap. I mean, this is about £600 or $600, and the Metabone speed booster I showed you is about the same price again. I do go over budget options later in the course, but these are some samples from the Sigma 1.8 speed boosted to 1.2. Personally, I think this depth of field is shallow enough, and any shallower than that and it actually gets more difficult to focus. That's specifically a problem for the next lens, which is a 42.5mm native Panasonic Leica 1.2. Brand new, these lenses will go for a whopping $1,000 plus price tag. But if you're a sucker for a shallow depth of field and you're considering it, these are the kinds of shots you can get wide open. Panasonic actually sell a 42.5mm 1.7, which comes pretty close to the f1.2, but at a fraction of the cost. It also happens to be smaller and lighter and lets you get shots like this. If 1.7 and 1.2 is just not enough, then you really need to visit the Voigtlander series. Now these go down to a crazy 0.95 aperture, although wide open I have heard of some issues with colour. So those are some lens options that offer seriously fast apertures. They're all pretty expensive, other than the f1.7, so I do cover cheaper options in a different lecture. I don't mean this to be a lens review lecture, but it's important to consider the fact that these expensive fast lenses do come with their own drawbacks as well. So for the Sigma, for example, using a speed booster with that will pretty much kill your autofocus capabilities. And also it's a big heavy lens, which negates some of the benefits of this format in the first place. That's a topic for another time, but for now, shallow depth of field is concerned, the third feature to be aware of is the distances. Specifically, we're looking at the distance between the camera, the subject, and the background. The key thing to remember here is that the camera will give a deeper depth of field when you're focusing further away than if you're focusing close up. So here in the middle distance, we've got a subject who's in focus. You'd expect the objects before and further away than the subject to be out of focus. Now, if you move that subject closer to the background, further away from the camera, the depth of field at the same aperture will be deeper, which means that the subject and the background will be in focus. Now, if you want to maximize the shallow depth of field, you want to move the subject closer to the camera, as close as possible really for your framing, and that will give you the shallowest depth of field possible. And also it will move them further away from the background, so it has the added effect of making the background even blurrier. In all these examples, I'm using a subject which is close to the camera, which gives a shallow depth of field, and sometimes I'll even cheat and just put the lens to the minimum focus distance and then shoot from there, knowing that it's going to give me the shallowest depth of field. I must say I am guilty of being a bit of a sucker for the shallow depth of field look. I do like it. To summarise how to get it on these cameras, a fast lens is going to help, and you'll be shooting wide open. Hopefully it's a long lens, because that will also help get a shallow depth of field, and also bringing the subject close to the camera will help. I just finished this section off by saying if you're going to be outside shooting in the middle of the day and you want a shallow depth of field, obviously opening the lens aperture up all the way is going to mean that at least your highlights are likely to be overblown, and probably more than that. Obviously you could just speed up the shutter speed and that would help bring down the exposure to acceptable levels, but that might make your motion look a bit dodgy. So you might want to consider an ND filter that will let you keep the shutter speed at double the frame rate and then also open your aperture up wide open. The GH5 has an extended ISO option which lets you reduce the ISO to 100, and you might be thinking that might be a good way to go during the day, but it's actually known to limit your dynamic range and also make the highlights harsher, so it's not recommended. In this one we're going to be looking at the focus transition feature. What it does is it lets you set 2 points of focus, and at the click of a button, even while recording, it will flip between those 2 points. You'll notice in cinema that they pull focus between two objects all the time. It's a cool way to reveal something that's in the scene that the viewer might not have noticed before that they want to bring your attention to. Or they might be showing you what the actor is looking at. Or they might just be pulling focus between two actors or objects that they're interacting with. Unfortunately for pulling focus, the Panasonic lenses aren't the best. They're focused by wire, which just means that the focus ring turns forever. There are no stops at either end, and also no range given on the lens itself. It just means there's less feel when it comes to pulling focus compared to a normal manual lens. On a regular focus mechanism, when you've got stops at either end of the focal range, and also distances given on the lens itself, you can use the finger trick. The finger trick is good when you've got a focus pull to do between two objects in a scene. What you do is you set focus to the second object that you're going to be focusing on, and at that point you put the finger at the top of the lens, the very top in the middle. Whilst keeping your finger on the focus ring in the middle of the lens, hold focus to the first object that you want to be focused on the scene, and then hold it there. Then you're ready to roll. You've got your first object in focus, and when it's time to transition that focus, it's just a case of twisting the focus wheel whilst keeping your finger in the same place, and when it returns to the middle at the top, you know you've got focus on the second object that you set earlier. Fortunately, the GH5 and GH5S come with a brilliant feature that helps you pull focus, and I use it a lot. It's called focus transition. It allows you to set several focus points in camera, and then at a touch of a button it will flip between them so you don't need to rack focus yourself. It's really good for slider work or using on gimbals or on pans, because obviously it means that you don't need to be pulling focus, you can be holding something else. So here's how you use it on the GH5. You want the menu at the top, which is the movie camera M mode, and there on page 2 you'll see the option for focus transition. Click into that and you can see all the options. First of all, you've got focus pull setting, which is where you go to set your focus points. Then you've got focus transition speed, which is where you tell it how fast you want it to pull focus between the points. Then you've got focus transition rec, which tells the camera which focus position to go to when you hit record. And lastly, you've got focus transition weight, This one allows you to set a delay between hitting the button and it actually doing the focus transition. That's handy if you've got a wobbly camera setup, for example. So your first step will be to set the focus points that you want the camera to rack focus between. So clicking into position 1, you actually zoom on the camera to one of your focus points and then hit set. Here I've done it with the focus wheel on the lens itself, but when I do this for position 2 right now, you'll see that you can also tap to focus. So you can tap an area, hit the AF button, and it will focus on your area. Now set that as position 2, so the camera's got 2 points where it knows I want to rack focus between. Step 2 is to determine how fast you actually want it to pull focus. So SH, I'm presuming, stands for super high, the fastest mode, down to SL for super low, for the slowest method. I like M, it feels more natural to me. The next step is optional, and that's to determine whether you want the camera to go to position 1 or position 2 the moment you hit record. Now please note, if you want to use this, you actually have to use the little red record button. Using the shutter won't actually activate that. I'm going to leave that off for this example. Now your last step is to determine whether you want the camera to wait at all between you selecting the focus area and actually pulling that focus. I'm going to leave that off as well. So hit start and you're actually ready to go. So I would normally hit record first to get rolling, and then I would click using either the scroll wheel, the joystick, or actually touching the screen itself to flip between the 2 focus points that I've set. You can see here that it will just hit those markers every time with 100% precision, which is very difficult to do in camera, especially with a fly-by-wire focus wheel. I'm just going to back out of that and actually change up the focus transition speed just so you can see, for example, what SH will do. And as you might be expecting, it's very fast. This mode would be useful if you're on a gimbal, for example, and you're trying to shoot an action scene between 2 subjects. One of them being near and one of them being far, you'll get a really fast focus between the 2. So there are 4 caveats to this otherwise excellent feature. First of all, it doesn't really work with non-native lenses. If you try it on a Sigma 18-35, you'll notice that it doesn't really work. Your focus point that you set will be different when it goes back to it, and it'll just miss focus. Secondly, it doesn't work on the Panasonic mobile app over Wi-Fi, which is no real surprise because the app is garbage. Thirdly, if you're using a zoom lens, you need to be really careful not to zoom by accident, because if you zoom a little bit, it might throw out your focus points. So when you come to pull focus to that point that you've set, it might still be out of focus. And lastly, if one of your focus points is just a little bit out, you can't manually focus just to change that. It will just go to the predefined points every time. Let's talk about which picture settings you want to be using for a cinematic result. For me, that comes down to 2 things. First of all, how much you want to be able to grade the footage in post, and also a dynamic range. And if those 2 factors are important to you, you need to be considering Cine-D or Vlog for your profiles. They come out flatter, meaning there's less of the camera's colour signs baked into the footage. And if you really want to get creative with the colour grade, you should really be considering using the 10-bit profiles. Unfortunately, if you want to work in 4K, the 10-bit modes are restricted to the 24 and 25p profiles. You can't do 4K 60 or 4K 50p in 10-bit. Now for me, because the 10-bit profile is vital when you're using Vlog, that means I wouldn't want to be shooting 4K 50 in Vlog. If you really want that 4K 50 or 4K 60 slow motion, for me you've got 2 options. You've either got the chance to output your footage over the HDMI to something like an Atomos recorder. Now that's an expensive setup, but it does allow you to output 4K 50 or 60 at 10-bit. Alternatively, you should think about the Cine-D profile and sticking to 8-bit 4K 50 or 60. A quick note on colour grading while we're talking about Cine-D and Log. They are not going to give you an easy time. They do give you more latitude to grade, but it's not necessarily going to be straightforward, and it will take more time. This, for example, is what Cine-D looks like before you've done anything to it. Now, my biggest complaint is the skin tones. It can sometimes look a bit yellow or plasticky or alien, and that for me is a big issue. So you absolutely have to correct even Cine-D footage with a LUT. I will look at doing a separate video on colour grading. I might even include my own corrective LUT. But here you can see the difference when I apply a LUT that corrects the footage. It just looks a bit more natural. Maybe a bit on the pink side, but you can easily correct it from there. All the colours are still popping and the people look human, which helps. Here's that comparison again. This is before, alien skin tones, not much contrast, and after, human skin tones, more contrast. So what about log? Well, this is what it looks like before, and if you see some tutorials, some people might say, Well, all you need to do with log is add saturation and give it more contrast. So let's see what happens when you do that. So this is log with contrast and saturation added. And don't get me wrong, it looks better, but it's not actually right. When you're shooting in log, there's a different colour space used, and you actually need to convert that using a LUT, which is not necessarily understood by most people. Luckily, Panasonic provide a LUT to correct the log footage, and this is what that looks like. So I wouldn't describe this as perfect. I am looking kind of pink, but to be honest, I'm a pink kind of guy. I live in the north of England and the sun just doesn't agree with me. So that's not actually too far off. But what I want to point out is if you look at the before and after, this is by just adding contrast and saturation. I mean, I don't have the best skin in the world, but it's really not favourable around my mouth. I look like I've got some kind of disease. There's some yellows in there that are really unkind. The Panasonic LUT here has helped me look a bit more natural. So essentially, I just would not trust people that say you can just grade log footage by adding saturation and contrast, because I don't think that's the case. Because these are flatter profiles, you'll get better dynamic range from Cine-D and Vlog. Now don't get me wrong, the Vlog, being a paid upgrade on the GH5, is going to be a step above Cine-D in terms of dynamic range. So if that was your ultimate priority, then Vlog is probably going to give you the best results. But otherwise, Cine-D is a good option, and it does have a slight edge in terms of dynamic range over the other profiles. When you've got a really contrasty scene, so you've got bright highlights and also lots of shadows, then that's where these flatter profiles really come into their own. Good dynamic range is where you can see detail in both the highlights and the shadows at the same time. So if you have a scene with a sky, for example, you can see the colour and the clouds in the sky, and also you can see details in the shadows. And that's often equated with being a cinematic look, where you can see the details right across the spectrum. If you ever shot a portrait or people in broad daylight, you'll know how difficult it is to get a good exposure on the skin tones whilst not blowing out the sky and having that come out pure white. There's nothing more frustrating than having a sunny scene, but the sun and the sky just come out pure white because the camera can't deal with the detail across that range. Now in that scenario where you're shooting people outside and the sky is visible, an expensive cinema camera might be able to capture all the detail there across the highlights and the shadows, and that's partly why they're so expensive. But us GH5 and GH5S users are more likely to need to make a choice. Is the sky, for example, or whatever area is being blown out, is it an important feature of the frame? In which case you might want to bring down the exposure so that you capture the detail in the clouds and the colour in the sky. I do expect light sources and strong reflections to blow out where I don't get any detail in them at all and they just come out pure white. But if I am dealing with the sky and I've got a person in frame, it's then a creative decision about whether you want to bring down that exposure or let the skin really take main stage and look as good as it can be whilst the sky might be blown out in pure white. It's also a common problem indoors, where the light coming in from the windows is really strong and you've got details outside of the windows that you could potentially see, but you've got a subject indoors, say a person for example. So if you're just working with that daylight and you don't have lights inside to fight it with, then for me it makes most sense sometimes to bring down the exposure so you can see what's outside and you can see the detail in the window, even if that means the subject or your people inside are a little bit darker. Whether you want to bring down your exposure so that you preserve the detail and the colour in the highlights is going to be a creative decision you have to make. But bear in mind, if you want to try and fight the daylight, if you try and do that using the ISO, then there is a dynamic range impact there, as the dynamic range will fall as you raise the ISO. You are already losing dynamic range at 800 ISO, but it does deteriorate noticeably beyond that. And also it goes without saying that pumping the ISO like that on the GH5 will give you noisier footage. Micro Four Thirds cameras like the GH5 and GH5S have a bit of a bad reputation on the market for dynamic range, and there is some merit to that argument, but it is worth remembering that some more expensive cameras, some of the Canons for example, such as the 1DX Mark II, have about the same dynamic range. Both of these cameras are rated at about 13 stops for video. Now where the 1DX Mark II will excel is it will hold on to its dynamic range for longer while you're pushing those ISOs, whereas the GH5 is going to lose 3 stops in its dynamic range, going from base ISO to just 1600 ISO. So to summarise, if you want 4K, you want slow motion at 50 or 60p, and you know you're going to want to push the colours around a lot in post, my recommendation is you use 8-bit Cine-D. If you're not tied to 4K or you're not tied to the slow motion, you should be able to use 10-bit, and that will give you the most latitude to grade in post. And Cine-D and Vlog will give you the best dynamic range you can get out of the camera, with Vlog being a step above Cine D, albeit a paid option. The origins of the widescreen format are in the cinema. That was their USP to get people into the door and see these big vistas on the big screen in widescreen. The Cinema 4K modes on the GH5 and GH5S will give you that widescreen look right out of the box. Now, don't forget they're not available on 50p or 60p if you've got a GH5. Just the GH5S can do Cinema 4K at 50 and 60p. Also, they're only available in the NTSC mode. So if you're a PAL shooter and you really want to use them, you have to change the camera to NTSC mode, which comes with its own risks. I'll just let you know, if you've jumped to this section, I deal with the pitfalls of using NTSC mode in the PAL region in the 4K 50 and 60 slow motion section earlier on. Wide lenses tend to be about 12mm, but here's a 15mm on a gimbal. Now on a full frame camera, 15mm would be really wide, but due to the crop factor on our GH5 and GH5S cameras, it's not that wide. We've got to work that bit harder to get really wide, so let's take a look at some options. Panasonic do this wide angle zoom, which is the 7 to 14mm. The thing is, it's f4 and it's not exactly cheap, so that's not fast enough for me. Olympus do a brilliant 7 to 14 2.8, which is faster and weatherproof, but so expensive. On the cheaper side, you have this Samyang 7.5mm, but it's 3.5 max aperture, so it's not the fastest, plus it's fisheye, so you get that GoPro distorted effect. So I've gone for the Laowa 7.5mm because it's f2, so it's fast, it's low distortion, and it's also relatively cheap. Here's some footage you get with this lens. So it's reasonably wide at 7.5mm, it's a 15mm full frame equivalent on the GH5. It'd be even wider than that on the GH5S. And it seems a good compromise. It's faster than the Olympus 7 to 14, although it's about half the price.